Every time you stood in line at your local post office, mailing letters and greeting neighbors in what seemed like the most ordinary American space imaginable, you never suspected that someone might be listening from inside the walls. What if I told you that in 1989, an electrician accidentally discovered a still-powered surveillance device hidden in a Maryland post office that had been recording citizens for 30 years, and when the FBI finally investigated, they found 11 more just like it, all part of a massive Cold War spying program so secret that not even the FBI had any official records it ever existed? On October 23, 1989, just 3 weeks after the Berlin Wall began to crack, James Kellerman drove his white Ford pickup into the parking lot of the Bethesda Main Post Office on Wisconsin Avenue. He was 47 years old, a commercial electrician who had been working government contracts for nearly 2 decades. The post office was a squat brick building from the 1950s, the kind of utilitarian federal architecture that dotted suburban Maryland. Kellerman had won the bid to modernize its electrical systems, a job worth $47,000 with a 6-week timeline. He stepped out of his truck, carrying a metal clipboard and a voltage tester. The morning was cold, the kind of October day that reminded people winter was coming. Inside, the building smelled like old paper and floor wax, sounds of mail sorting machines rumbling from somewhere below. Kellerman had done this kind of work before. Schools, DMV offices, municipal buildings. Nothing exciting. Replace outdated wiring, install new breaker panels, bring everything up to code. The post office would stay operational during the work, mail delivery continuing on the first floor while his crew worked upstairs. He met with the facility manager, a tired-looking man named Gordon, who handed him a ring of keys and a building schematic that looked older than Kellerman himself. The second floor was mostly administrative offices and storage, Gordon explained. Half of it hadn't been used in years. Kellerman walked the building with his 2 crew members, Rick and Danny, both younger men who had worked for him for 5 years. They mapped out the job, identifying where new conduits would run, where panels needed replacement, which walls they would need to open. The building's electrical system was a mess, typical of 1950s construction. Cloth-insulated wiring, undersized circuits, no grounding in half the outlets. It would take the full 6 weeks, maybe longer if they found problems behind the walls. Kellerman had been an electrician since 1964, after coming back from Korea, where he had worked as a communications technician in the Army. He was methodical, careful, the kind of contractor who documented everything and never cut corners. That first day, they spent 8 hours just surveying and planning. By evening, Kellerman had a detailed work order written out, materials list complete, timeline mapped to the day. He locked up his tools in the truck and drove home to Silver Spring, thinking about nothing more complicated than what his wife Carol would have made for dinner. He had no idea that in 2 weeks he would find something that would change everything he thought he knew about government buildings, about trust, about who was watching whom during the long Cold War years when paranoia had seeped into the walls themselves. Week 2 arrived with cold rain. It was November 7th, 1989, and Kellerman's crew was working on the second floor in a corner office that hadn't seen occupants in years. Dust covered everything. Old filing cabinets lined one wall, full of records nobody had bothered to move. They needed to access the main electrical conduit that ran vertically through the building. The conduit was hidden somewhere behind the wall, and the 1950s schematic was vague about its exact location. Kellerman made the decision to open up a section of wall to find it. Rick brought the reciprocating saw. They cut carefully through the plaster and lath, working from an electrical outlet upward, following where the wiring suggested the main conduit would be. The plaster was thick, reinforced with wire mesh underneath. When they pulled away the first section, they found the expected void between the interior and exterior walls. But they also found something unexpected. A hollow space, deeper than normal, running the entire length of the wall. About 2 feet of empty space where there should have been insulation or structural support. Kellerman directed Rick to cut a larger opening. They removed 3 feet of wall horizontally, exposing the cavity more clearly. The space ran at least 15 feet in length, carefully constructed, almost like it had been planned during the building's original construction. Danny climbed a ladder to peer into the upper section with a flashlight. That's when he saw it. A metal box, approximately 8 inches by 12 inches, mounted on brackets attached to the wall studs. The box was painted the same dull gray as the studs themselves, clearly meant to blend in. Kellerman climbed the ladder himself to examine it. The box had no manufacturer markings, no labels, just a small keyhole on the front panel. What caught his attention immediately was the electrical connection. A dedicated line, separate from the building's main wiring, ran from the box upward through the ceiling. He touched the box carefully. It was warm. The line was active, power flowing through it even now, 30-some years after this building had been constructed. A faint humming sound came from inside, barely audible over the background noise of the mail sorting operation below. Kellerman felt his chest tighten. He had worked in government buildings long enough to know when something was wrong. This box was hidden deliberately, powered, continuously, maintained in secrecy for decades. He did not know what it was, but every instinct told him it was not supposed to be there. He told Rick and Danny to take an early lunch. After they left, he carefully photographed the box, the mounting brackets, the electrical connection, everything. Kellerman worked alone for the next hour, documenting the installation with the thoroughness that had defined his 25 years in the trade. He took 12 photographs from different angles, sketched the wiring diagram, measured the box dimensions, noted the gauge of the electrical line feeding it. The box was secured with 4 machine screws to a metal bracket that had been bolted directly into the wall studs. The electrical line ran upward through a carefully drilled hole in the top plate, disappearing into the ceiling space. Professional installation, nothing improvised or temporary about it. He tested the voltage on the line. 120 volts AC, standard building power, but on a dedicated circuit isolated from everything else. The box drew minimal current, maybe half an amp, suggesting whatever was inside had low power requirements. Kellerman made a decision. He shut off the power at the main panel, waited 5 minutes for any capacitors inside to discharge, then carefully disconnected the electrical line. He removed the mounting screws with a socket wrench, supporting the box's weight as the last screw came free. The box was heavier than expected, maybe 15 pounds. He carried it down the ladder and set it on a dust-covered desk. Up close, the construction was impressive. Precision-welded seams, military-grade materials, nothing cheap or commercial about it. The lock was a simple cylinder type, the kind you might find on a filing cabinet. When Rick and Danny returned from lunch, Kellerman was back at work on the electrical conduit. He said nothing about the box, which now sat in his truck wrapped in a canvas tarp. He told them the wall cavity was clear and they could proceed with the new wiring. That evening, Kellerman drove home with the box beside him on the passenger seat. Carol was visiting her sister in Baltimore, would not be back until Thursday. He was grateful for the privacy. He carried the box into his garage workshop and set it on his main workbench under the bright halogen lamp. For a long time, he just looked at it. This was government property, found in a government building during a government contract. The proper procedure would be to report it to the facility manager, let the postal service deal with whatever it was. But Kellerman had been in Korea during the war. He had seen things, learned things about how governments operated, about secrets and classifications and need-to-know restrictions. He recognized the marks of intelligence work when he saw them. He opened his tool drawer and selected a drill bit. The lock was simple. He could remove it without damaging the box, satisfy his curiosity, then decide what to do next. The drill bit cut through the soft brass of the lock cylinder in 90 seconds. Kellerman worked carefully, collecting the metal shavings on a paper towel, not wanting to contaminate whatever was inside. When the cylinder fell free, he used a flathead screwdriver to turn the locking mechanism. The lid lifted on small hinges. Inside, packed carefully in custom-cut foam padding, was electronic equipment that made Kellerman's breath catch. A reel-to-reel tape mechanism, miniaturized but clearly functional, with a partially filled tape reel mounted on the spindle. Below that, a circuit board maybe 4 inches square, populated with vacuum tubes and transistors. The vacuum tubes were the type he remembered from military radios in Korea, from the early days of his career before solid-state electronics became standard. 1950s technology, maybe early 60s. The tape mechanism had a recording head assembly positioned to contact the tape, a motor to drive the reels, and what looked like a voice activation circuit. This was a listening device, a bug, hidden inside the wall of a United States post office, powered by the building's own electrical system, recording sounds from the office on the other side of that wall for years, maybe decades. Kellerman sat down heavily on his shop stool. He had found government surveillance equipment in a government building. But whose? Why? How long had it been there? He looked at the tape reel. It was about 2/3 full, suggesting either the tape had been running for years or the voice activation had limited how much was recorded. The tape was magnetic medium, possibly degraded after 3 decades, but likely still playable. He needed help. This was beyond his expertise. He needed someone who understood surveillance technology, who could tell him what this was and what it meant. Someone he could trust. Robert Chen came to mind immediately. They had met in 1976 at a community college electronics course Kellerman had taken for continuing education credits. Chen had been the instructor, retired from Bell Labs after 30 years developing telephone systems. They had stayed friends, occasionally meeting for lunch, talking about technology and old war stories. Chen lived in Rockville, 15 minutes away. He was 68 now, sharp as ever, with a workshop in his basement that rivaled anything Bell Labs had owned. If anyone could analyze this device, it was Chen. Kellerman carefully closed the box, wrapped it in the canvas tarp, and carried it to his truck. He called Chen from the kitchen phone. Chen answered on the 3rd ring, his voice carrying the slight accent of someone who had learned English as a second language 60 years ago in Taiwan. Kellerman asked if he could come by. Chen said yes, always. Bring coffee if you can. Chen's basement workshop was exactly as Kellerman remembered, 2 long workbenches lined with test equipment, oscilloscopes, and signal generators, and power supplies that hummed quietly in the fluorescent light. The walls were covered with reference charts and component specifications from decades of telephone systems work. Chen was wearing a cardigan sweater over a button-down shirt, reading glasses perched on his nose. He took the box from Kellerman without a word and set it on the main workbench, turning on the overhead magnifying lamp. Kellerman watched as Chen opened the lid and examined the contents. The old engineer said nothing for several minutes, just looking, occasionally touching a component with a wooden probe, his face expressionless behind the reading glasses. Finally, Chen spoke. "This is voice-activated recording equipment," he said. "Probably built in the late 1950s, maybe as late as 1963, based on the component types. The vacuum tubes are Western Electric, The tape mechanism looks like Ampex miniature format, American-made professional grade. He pointed to the circuit board. "This here is the voice activation trigger," he said. "It monitors audio input, and when sound exceeds a threshold level, it activates the tape motor. Records until silence returns, then stops. Very efficient, preserves tape, can run for months or years on a single reel." Kellerman asked if this was FBI or CIA. Chen shook his head. "Impossible to say without more context. Both agencies used similar equipment during this period. So did military intelligence, NSA, probably others. The technology was not unique, but the implementation is sophisticated. Whoever built this knew what they were doing." Chen pointed to the power connection. "This is what concerns me most," he said. "The device was connected to building power, meaning it could operate indefinitely. No need to change batteries, no need to access the device once installed. It could record for years without maintenance." "But here is the interesting part," Chen continued. "The tape reel has never been changed. It is partially full, maybe 60%, but it has never been removed and replaced. This suggests the device was either abandoned, forgotten, or the operation ended before anyone retrieved it." Kellerman asked the question that had been bothering him since he found the box. "What was it listening to?" Chen looked at him seriously. "Only one way to find out," he said. "I have equipment that can play this tape. Magnetic degradation is a concern after 30 years, but the tape appears intact. We can try." Chen began setting up a reel-to-reel player, one that could handle the miniature format. It took 20 minutes to configure everything properly, to connect amplifiers and speakers. The tape began to play with a soft hiss of magnetic noise. At first, nothing. Just the ambient hum of an empty room, occasional pops and crackles from degraded coating. Then voices, distant and muffled, barely distinguishable from the background static. Chen adjusted the playback speed, tweaked the equalization, filtered out some of the noise. The voices became clearer. A man and a woman discussing mail routes, delivery schedules, something about registered packages requiring signatures. Mundane office conversation, the kind that happened in every workplace in America. The recording jumped suddenly, the voice activation having stopped and restarted. Another conversation, different voices, this time about union meetings, someone complaining about overtime policies, another person defending management decisions. Normal workplace conflict. Nothing unusual. Kellerman and Chen listened for 40 minutes as the tape played fragments of conversations spanning what must have been years. The topics changed, the voices changed, but the content remained ordinary. Postal workers discussing their jobs, their grievances, their lives. Nothing classified, nothing dramatic. Then, at 42 minutes into the playback, something different. Two men speaking quietly, their voices more careful, more deliberate. One had a distinct Eastern European accent, the kind Kellerman remembered from Soviet broadcasts he had heard during his military service. The accented voice said something about a package that needed to be held at the window. Not processed through normal channels, but held specifically for collection. The other voice, American, flat and professional, confirmed the arrangement. A time was mentioned, Tuesday afternoon, 3 o'clock. A name was given, something that sounded like Kowalski or Kowalski. The conversation lasted maybe 90 seconds. Then it ended abruptly, and the tape returned to normal office chatter about someone's vacation plans in Atlantic City. Chen stopped the playback. He looked at Kellerman, his face serious. "This is not just surveillance of postal workers," he said. "This is evidence of something else. Dead drops, maybe. Using the post office as a communication point between parties who should not be seen together." Kellerman felt cold, The Cold War had ended, everyone said. The Berlin Wall was coming down, the Soviet Union was collapsing, the threat was over. But this tape proved that for decades, someone had been using America's post offices for espionage operations, and someone in the government had known about it, had installed listening devices to monitor those operations, had collected intelligence while American citizens went about their daily lives, completely unaware they were standing in the middle of a battlefield. Kellerman sat in Chen's basement workshop, the weight of what he had found pressing down on him like a physical thing. He had carried this device out of a federal building. He had opened it, examined it, played the tape. Technically, he had probably broken several laws. Chen seemed to read his thoughts. "You need to report this," he said. "This is not something you can ignore or forget. This is evidence of intelligence operations, possibly still active for all we know. The FBI needs to see this." Kellerman nodded slowly. He knew Chen was right. But the thought of walking into the FBI with a surveillance device he had taken from a post office made him deeply uncomfortable. He imagined being arrested, charged with theft of government property, his security clearance revoked, his business destroyed. Chen stood up and poured coffee from a thermos he kept on the workbench. "Listen," he said. "You did nothing wrong. You found something unusual during legitimate work. You investigated to determine what it was, and now you are doing the right thing by reporting it. This is exactly what any responsible citizen should do." Kellerman drank the coffee, thinking. Finally, he made a decision. Tomorrow morning he would call the FBI's Washington field office. He would explain what he found, offer to bring the device in, cooperate fully. He had done government work long enough to know that honesty was the only safe path. That night, Kellerman barely slept. He kept thinking about the tape, about the accented voice, about packages held at windows and people meeting in post offices who should not be seen together. He thought about his son, 23 now and working in Baltimore, growing up during the Cold War, without ever knowing that the friendly post office where they mailed Christmas cards was also serving as a drop point for espionage operations. The next morning, December 8th, 1989, Kellerman called the FBI. He asked for the Counterintelligence Division, was transferred twice, finally reached a duty agent who took his information. Kellerman explained who he was, that he held an active security clearance through his defense contractor work, that he had found something during a post office renovation that needed immediate attention. The agent asked careful questions. "What kind of device? Where exactly did you find it? Have you opened it? Have you told anyone else?" Kellerman answered everything honestly, mentioned Chen's involvement, offered to bring everything in immediately. The agent said someone would call him back within the hour. Kellerman waited by the phone, watching the clock in his kitchen, wondering if he had just made a terrible mistake or done exactly the right thing. 45 minutes later, the phone rang. The woman on the line identified herself as Special Agent Patricia Lowell, Counterintelligence Division. She asked if Kellerman could meet her at the Washington field office that afternoon. He said yes. Lowell met him in a conference room on the 4th floor, a space with no windows and furniture that looked like it had been ordered from a government catalog in 1975. She was in her mid-30s, dark hair pulled back, wearing a gray suit that was professional without being formal. Kellerman brought everything: the device, the tape, his photographs from the post office, his documentation of the electrical connections, his notes from Chen's analysis. He laid it all out on the conference table methodically, the way he would present evidence to a building inspector. Lowell examined each item carefully. She put on latex gloves before handling the device, opened the lid, studied the components without touching them. She listened to Kellerman's explanation of where he found it, how it was installed, what Chen had determined about its function. Then she asked to hear the tape. Kellerman had brought Chen's portable player, the one they had used the night before. He set it up and played the relevant section, the conversation with the Eastern European accent, the discussion about holding packages. Lowell listened without expression. When the playback finished, she asked Kellerman to play it again. She took notes this time, writing in precise shorthand that filled 3 pages of a legal pad. She asked about the post office. Which office had the device been hidden in? Who had access to that space? How long had the room been unused? Kellerman answered everything he could. The second-floor office was mostly storage now, he explained. Old records, filing cabinets full of papers nobody had looked at in years. The facility manager said it had been administrative space in the 1950s and 60s, but reorganization had made it redundant. Lowell made more notes. She asked about his crew, whether they had seen the device, whether he had told anyone else besides Chen. Kellerman explained he had kept it quiet, moved the box to his truck before his crew returned from lunch, told no one except Chen because he needed technical expertise. The interview lasted 90 minutes. When it ended, Lowell thanked Kellerman for bringing this to their attention. She said the Bureau would keep the device and tape for analysis, that he had done the right thing by reporting it, that someone might contact him with follow-up questions. She asked him to keep this confidential. National security concerns, she said. Ongoing investigations. Kellerman understood. He signed a statement confirming everything he had told her, then left the building. Weeks passed with no word from the FBI. December turned to January of 1990. Kellerman completed the post office electrical job on schedule, finishing the last circuit on January 19th. He found no other hidden devices, though he looked carefully in every wall cavity, every ceiling space, every place something could be concealed. He said nothing to his crew about what he had found. Rick and Danny never asked about the box from the second-floor wall, probably assuming it was just obsolete junction equipment or a failed attempt at intercom wiring from decades past. The post office reopened fully after inspection, all systems upgraded to code, electrical panels gleaming and new. Kellerman collected his final payment and moved on to the next job, a school renovation in Chevy Chase. He occasionally wondered what had happened with the FBI investigation. Had they identified the voices on the tape? Had they found other devices in other post offices? Had they determined who installed them and why? But his security clearance and his professional obligations meant he could not ask casual questions. Lowell had said to keep it confidential, and he took that seriously. What Kellerman did not know, could not know, was that the device had been logged into the FBI evidence system on December 12, 1989. Lowell had filed a comprehensive report documenting the discovery, including technical specifications, audio samples from the tape, and her assessment that this represented potential Cold War-era domestic surveillance. But the Bureau was stretched thin in early 1990. The intelligence landscape was shifting dramatically. The Berlin Wall had fallen in November. Eastern Europe was in upheaval, communist governments collapsing like dominoes. The Soviet Union itself showed signs of fracturing. Resources were being redirected to monitor these historic changes. A 30-year-old listening device found in a Maryland post office seemed like historical curiosity, not active threat. Important, yes. Worth investigating, certainly. But not urgent compared to tracking the dissolution of the Soviet Empire and the intelligence chaos that would follow. The device was placed in evidence storage, case file marked for follow-up when resources allowed. Lowell moved on to more pressing cases. The Washington field office was handling dozens of counterintelligence operations simultaneously, and a cold case from the 1950s could wait. The device sat in storage for 8 months. Temperature controlled, properly labeled, completely forgotten. If Kellerman had known, he might have felt disappointed. He had uncovered something significant, handed it to the proper authorities, done everything right, and it had simply disappeared into bureaucratic limbo. But in August of 1990, something changed. The FBI's Technical Services Division at Quantico received a directive in early August of 1990. The memo came from FBI Director William Sessions himself, instructing the Technical Analysis Section to conduct systematic evaluation of electronics seized in various cases over the past several years. This was part of a broader initiative to improve the Bureau's technical capabilities and institutional knowledge. Too often, sophisticated devices sat in evidence storage without proper analysis, their intelligence value unrealized. The directive aimed to correct that. The Bethesda post office device was included in a batch of 12 items sent to Quantico on August 24, 1990. Each item came with its case file, evidence logs, and any preliminary analysis performed at the field office level. The technician assigned to examine the device was Martin Kowalski, 52 years old, with a background in electrical engineering and 25 years of experience analyzing surveillance equipment. He had seen CIA bugs, KGB devices, commercial surveillance gear, homemade wiretaps, everything imaginable in the world of electronic espionage. When the package arrived on his workbench, Kowalski opened the evidence bag and immediately knew this was something unusual. The construction quality, the component selection, the sophisticated circuit design all indicated professional intelligence work from the Cold War era. He spent the first day just documenting, photographs from every angle, measurements of every component, detailed notes on construction methods. He identified the vacuum tubes as Western Electric manufacture, probably from 1957 to 1962, based on date codes stamped into the glass. The tape mechanism was Ampex miniature format, the kind used in professional recording applications where size and reliability mattered. The voice activation circuit was elegantly designed, using a simple but effective approach that would preserve tape and allow extended operation. But what really caught Kowalski's attention was the power supply design. This device was meant to run indefinitely on building current, never requiring battery changes, never needing human access after installation. That suggested a long-term surveillance operation, something measured in years rather than weeks or months. On the second day, Kowalski began reverse engineering the circuit design. He traced every connection, mapped every component, understanding how the device functioned. The audio input came from a small microphone positioned to pick up sound through the wall. The voice activation circuit monitored that input constantly, triggering the tape motor when sound exceeded threshold. The recording quality would be poor, distant voices through plaster and wood, but sufficient for intelligence purposes. You could identify speakers, catch keywords, establish patterns of activity. For counterintelligence operations, that was often enough. Kowalski photographed the chip markings and sent images to CIA technical services. Within 3 days, they confirmed what he suspected. The components were American-made, manufactured to FBI specifications in the late 1950s. Kowalski's discovery sent immediate alerts through the FBI's Technical Services Division. If this device was FBI manufactured, it should appear in records. Equipment procurement, operational budgets, installation logs, something should document its existence. But when Kowalski contacted the Bureau's Records Division, they found nothing. No authorization for surveillance at the Bethesda post office, no warrant applications, no operational files, no budget line items covering equipment installation or monitoring. According to official records, this device should not exist. Kowalski wrote a detailed report summarizing his findings and raising questions that needed answers. Who authorized the installation? What was the operational purpose? Where were the monitoring logs? Who retrieved and analyzed the tapes? Why was there no documentation? His report reached the Counterintelligence Division in early September 1990. Within days, a small team was formed to investigate. Not a full-scale operation, just 3 agents tasked with determining the scope and history of what appeared to be an undocumented surveillance program. The team started by contacting contractors working on post office renovations throughout the Washington metropolitan area. They issued a bulletin asking workers to report any unusual electronic equipment found in walls, ceilings, or other concealed spaces. The response was immediate and disturbing. On October 15, 1990, a contractor in Arlington, Virginia, reported finding a similar device during asbestos abatement work. The device was identical in design, installed in a second-floor wall, connected to building power, containing a partially filled tape reel. 2 weeks later, another device turned up in Alexandria during ceiling tile replacement. Then another in Silver Spring. By December of 1990, the FBI had identified 12 devices in post offices across the Washington area, all installed in the late 1950s or early 1960s, all hidden in concealed spaces, all connected to building power, all without any official record. The investigation expanded. FBI historians were brought in to search through archives, looking for any reference to postal surveillance programs. They spent weeks in storage facilities, pulling boxes of documents from the Hoover era, the period when J. Edgar Hoover had run the Bureau with absolute authority and minimal oversight. What they found was fragmentary and frustrating. Heavily redacted memos from 1957 through 1963 mentioned something called Operation Letterbox. Budget documents from the same period included line items for postal intelligence gathering. Internal reports referenced post office monitoring without explaining purpose or scope. But there were no comprehensive files, no operational plans, no installation logs, no recordings archive, no documentation explaining who authorized the program, what intelligence it was meant to gather, or why it had apparently ended without any effort to retrieve the devices. It was as if someone had deliberately erased the program from history, leaving only fragmentary references scattered across unrelated documents. By January of 1991, investigators had developed a working theory based on circumstantial evidence and historical context. The theory went like this. During the height of Cold War paranoia in the 1950s, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had authorized massive domestic surveillance programs targeting suspected communists, foreign agents, and anyone deemed a security risk. Post offices were strategic locations for intelligence gathering. They were public spaces where people from all backgrounds congregated. They handled international mail, which federal law already authorized monitoring under various executive orders. They employed thousands of workers, some with access to sensitive communication networks, and they were federal facilities, making surveillance easier to conceal. The FBI had probably installed listening devices in post offices throughout major metropolitan areas as part of a broader intelligence operation. The devices monitored not just suspected foreign agents, but also postal employees, union organizers, political activists, and ordinary citizens who happened to conduct business in those buildings. The operation was likely authorized at the highest levels, possibly by Hoover himself, with tacit approval from Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy. But it was deliberately left undocumented to avoid congressional oversight and public accountability. When the program ended, probably in the mid-1960s as surveillance technology evolved and political priorities shifted, the devices were simply abandoned. Removing them would have required explanations, paperwork, acknowledgement that they existed. Leaving them in place was simpler. Eventually, they would be discovered during renovations or demolitions, but by then, everyone involved would be dead or retired, and the truth would be buried under layers of bureaucratic silence. This theory explained everything investigators had found: the sophisticated design, the American components, the FBI manufacturing specifications, the lack of documentation, the widespread installation across multiple locations, the apparent abandonment without retrieval. But it was just a theory. Without documents, without witnesses, without any smoking gun proving authorization or operational details, investigators could not confirm it. They tried to find people who had been involved. They interviewed retired FBI agents from the 1950s and 60s. Most were dead. Those still alive claimed no knowledge of any postal surveillance program. They searched for technicians who would have installed the devices. Western Electric had employed thousands of people during that era. Personnel records were incomplete. Memories had faded. Nobody remembered anything about unusual installations in post offices 30 years earlier. They examined every tape recovered from the devices. Most contained nothing useful. Years of mundane conversations, background noise, deteriorated audio. A few tapes had segments suggesting foreign nationals using the facilities, but nothing definitive. Nothing that led to identifiable suspects or confirmed espionage. The investigation was hitting walls at every turn. By March of 1991, the FBI investigation had reached its practical limits. They had found 12 devices, analyzed their construction, documented their locations, recovered and examined the tapes, searched archives for documentary evidence, interviewed dozens of potential witnesses, and developed a plausible theory about what had happened. But they could not prove it. They could not determine who authorized the program, precisely when it operated, what intelligence it gathered, or why it ended. The devices were physical evidence of a secret surveillance operation, but the operation itself remained a ghost. The lead investigator, a senior agent named Catherine Moss, wrote the final report. It was 37 pages long, carefully worded, acknowledging what they knew and what remained unknown. Her conclusions were measured and honest. A covert surveillance program targeting United States post offices operated between approximately 1957 and 1965. The program installed at least 12 confirmed devices in the Washington metropolitan area, and likely more in other cities that remained undiscovered. Purpose appears to be counterintelligence and domestic security monitoring during the height of Cold War tensions. No records exist explaining authorization, operational scope, monitoring procedures, or formal termination. Based on technical analysis and historical context, the program was likely authorized at the FBI director level and deliberately left undocumented to avoid oversight. The program probably ended as surveillance technology evolved and political climate changed in the mid-1960s. Devices were abandoned in place rather than removed, suggesting the program was quietly discontinued without formal shutdown procedures. Tapes were never retrieved or analyzed systematically, indicating the program may have lost priority or been superseded by more sophisticated methods. Moss's report went to FBI Director William Sessions in April 1991. Sessions read it, marked it classified, and ordered it stored in the Bureau's restricted archives. There was nothing to be gained by publicizing a surveillance program from 30 years earlier, operated by people long dead, gathering intelligence of no current value. The devices themselves were catalogued, stored in climate-controlled evidence facilities, preserved as historical artifacts of the Cold War. The tapes were similarly archived, their contents transcribed and indexed, but never publicly released. On April 23, 1991, James Kellerman received a letter from the FBI. It was brief, almost perfunctory. The Bureau thanked him for his cooperation in a matter of national security importance. The matter had been resolved. No further action was required. He should continue to keep the circumstances confidential. The letter was signed by Patricia Lowell, the agent who had first interviewed him. Kellerman read it twice, then filed it away in his desk drawer. He understood what it meant. Whatever he had found was now classified, buried, beyond his reach. The Bethesda post office continued operating for another 12 years after Kellerman completed his electrical work. Mail was sorted, packages were delivered, customers stood in lines complaining about postal rates, and nobody knew that, for perhaps a decade, their conversations had been recorded by devices hidden in the walls. In 2003, the building was finally closed. The Postal Service consolidated operations to a larger facility in Rockville, more efficient, more modern, better suited to automated sorting systems, and increased package volume from the rise of Internet commerce. The building was sold to a commercial developer who planned to demolish it and build a mixed-use complex with retail space and residential apartments. On August 14, 2003, demolition crews arrived with excavators and jackhammers. If any other listening devices remained hidden in the building's walls or ceilings, they were destroyed with everything else. Within 2 weeks, the structure was reduced to rubble. The debris was loaded into trucks and hauled to landfills in rural Maryland, buried under tons of construction waste. Robert Chen died on March 7, 1995, at age 73. Heart attack, sudden and massive, while working in his basement workshop. His family cleared out the basement, sold most of the equipment to other electronics hobbyists, donated his reference books to the public library. He never spoke publicly about the device he had analyzed for Kellerman. The secret went to his grave. Another classified fact in a life that had touched many classified things during his years at Bell Labs and afterward. James Kellerman retired from electrical contracting in 1998 at age 56. His knees were bad, his back worse, and he was tired of climbing ladders and crawling through attics. He sold his business to Rick, his longtime crew member, who had become a master electrician himself. Kellerman occasionally thought about the device he had found. He wondered if the FBI had ever figured out the full story, whether they had found other devices, whether anyone had been prosecuted or exposed. But he never asked. The letter from Lowell had made clear he should consider the matter closed. In 2008, Kellerman's wife Carol died after a brief illness. In 2011, he moved to Florida to be near his son. He lived quietly, played golf badly, attended veterans events at the local VFW hall. He died on June 19, 2014, at age 72. His son found the FBI letter while clearing out his father's papers. It meant nothing to him, just another piece of official correspondence from his father's contracting days. He threw it away with boxes of old invoices and tax records. The tapes and devices found in 1989 through 1991 remain in FBI storage, classified, marked with case numbers that mean nothing to anyone.